Imagine a medieval village at dawn. Smoke rises from the chimneys of thatched cottages. The fields shimmer with morning dew, and peasants already bend their backs to the plow. Their lives seem defined by hunger, toil, and the ever-present threat of war. But looming over every harvest, every loaf of bread, every birth and death, was a force even more relentless: taxation. In the Middle Ages, taxes were not just coin handed to a collector. They were woven into every aspect of daily existence, taken in grain, in livestock, in labor, and in loyalty. From the lord in his manor to the priest in his chapel, every power above the peasant demanded a share. And for the serf or small farmer, there was no escape. The moment they sowed a seed, they sowed it partly for others. The moment they baked a loaf, it was already half-claimed. This was no simple system of fairness or mutual support. Taxes were obligations born of hierarchy and sanctified by law and faith. To resist them was to risk not only punishment, but exile, ruin, or even the accusation of sin. For a peasant, survival meant obedience. Even in years when harvests failed, when granaries were empty and children cried for food, the dues still had to be paid. Hunger was no excuse. The fields might be barren, but the taxman's hand never came away empty. The village itself seemed built to remind people of this inevitability. The Lord's manor loomed on the hill, symbol of worldly authority. The church spire pierced the sky, constant reminder of divine obligation. Between the two, peasants lived in the shadow of power, squeezed from both sides. To fail the Lord was treason. To fail the church was heresy. Either way, the cost was unbearable. Taxes were not only about money or goods. They were about control. They tied serfs to the land, ensured their dependence, and reminded them daily of their place in the order of things. Whether through the grain they surrendered, the days they labored without pay, or the coins they scraped together for endless dues, the message was clear. Nothing they produced was truly theirs. For the medieval peasant, taxation was not a season or a cycle. It was constant, invisible, unyielding. It crept into marriages, into funerals, into the very act of baking bread or grinding grain. From birth to death, there was always a fee, always a share taken. A man might dodge a storm, outlast a famine, or even escape an enemy raid, but he could not escape the hand of his Lord and his church. And so the peasant's life was never fully his own. Every furrow plowed, every sheaf harvested, carried within it a shadow, a reminder that the fruits of his labor would never stay entirely in his home. This was the true burden of the Middle Ages, not only hunger, war, or disease, but the certainty that taxation followed like a specter, inescapable, unquestionable, eternal. But who collected these taxes, and how were they extracted with such precision and cruelty? To answer that, we must climb the hill to the Lord's manor and see how noble power turned peasant sweat into wealth. At the heart of every medieval village stood the manor, the seat of the local lord, a fortress of authority whose shadow stretched across every cottage, every furrow, every life. For the peasants who worked the land, the Lord was more than a figure of power. He was the embodiment of law, order, and obligation, and from him flowed a relentless stream of taxes that no serf could evade. The most basic of these dues was a share of the harvest. When the fields ripened and the sheaves were gathered, the Lord's men stood ready with ledgers and carts. A fixed portion, often a third, sometimes more, was demanded before a family could store a single sack for themselves. Grain, beans, fruit, even honey from village hives, all of it was tallied, taken, and carried up to the manor granary. Even in years of blight, when fields yielded barely enough to stave off hunger, the Lord's portion was untouchable. But the demands did not end with crops. The Lord claimed a monopoly on many essential tools of survival. To grind grain, peasants had to use the Lord's mill. To bake bread, they had to use the Lord's oven. To press grapes, the Lord's winepress. Each service came with a fee, often paid in kind. If a family dared to grind grain at home, they risked harsh punishment, fines, confiscation, even destruction of their hand mills. Every step of transforming food from soil to table was taxed, ensuring the Lord profited from labor twice over, once in rent and again in usage. Beyond goods came labor itself. Known as corvée, this tax in sweat and blood required peasants to spend days, sometimes weeks each year, working the Lord's domain, the land set aside for his exclusive benefit. They plowed his fields, harvested his crops, repaired his roads, and fortified his walls, often at the very moment their own fields demanded attention. Failure to appear meant fines or beatings. To the serf, time itself was not his own. His labor belonged as much to his master as his body did. And then there were the more curious, insidious taxes, fees for marriage outside the manor, inheritance dues when a father died, payments for using village pastures or forests. Even milestones of life and death came with a toll. A man could not wed, bury his kin, or pass land to his children without the Lord's approval, and without handing over a portion of what little wealth he had. These demands were enforced not only by law, but by fear. The Lord had armed men at his command, bailiffs and reeves who patrolled villages, collected rents, and punished defaulters. Resistance was rare, for resistance was costly. The manor court, presided over by the Lord or his steward, ensured disputes were always settled in favor of power. In this system, justice itself was another instrument of taxation. For the medieval peasant, the Lord's demands were as unavoidable as the rising of the sun. He might run from war, hide from plague, or pray against famine, but the tax collector always came. To escape taxation was to escape feudalism itself, an impossibility for all but the bold few who fled into outlawry or the anonymity of growing towns. For everyone else, the Lord's hand reached into every harvest, every hearth, every cradle and grave. Yet the manor was only half the story. Beyond its walls loomed a far greater power, one that claimed not just the body, but the soul, the church. And its taxes were no less demanding, for they came wrapped not in the threat of swords, but in the promise of salvation, or the fear of damnation. If the Lord claimed the body and its labor, the church claimed the soul, and with it, a steady stream of wealth. No matter how meager a peasant's harvest, no matter how bare his cupboard or thin his children's faces, the church demanded its due. This was the tithe, 1/10 of everything a peasant produced, owed not to a man but to God himself. The tithe was more than a tax. It was a sacred obligation. Each harvest, peasants loaded wagons with grain, drove flocks of sheep or goats, or carried baskets of eggs and fruit to the parish priest. Failure to pay was not only rebellion against the church, but rebellion against heaven. The threat was not merely fines or confiscation, it was damnation. To withhold the tithe was to risk one's eternal soul. For a deeply religious people, that fear was more binding than chains. The burden was immense. Imagine a peasant family who had already given 1/3 of their harvest to the Lord. From what remained, they now owed 1/10 to the church. If the year had been poor, if hail had flattened the barley or rats had eaten the stores, the tithe still had to be paid. The priest's barns grew full even as the peasants' bowls stayed empty. And when hunger struck, the irony was cruel. The church sometimes sold grain back to starving villagers at inflated prices. But the tithe was not confined to crops. It extended to wool shorn from sheep, milk from cows, honey from hives, even fish pulled from streams. Every product of the earth and beast bore the church's mark. In some parishes, peasants even owed a mortuary fee, a payment of their best garment or animal when they died, as though their final breath carried a tax of its own. The church's demands were justified as holy. The tithe, priests said, sustained God's house, maintained the clergy, and funded charity for the poor. And indeed, some of it did. Monasteries distributed alms, cared for orphans, and fed beggars at their gates. Yet vast portions went to gilded altars, soaring cathedrals, and the luxuries of high-ranking clergy. For peasants who trudged barefoot and hungry, the sight of bishops in silks and gold rings was a bitter reminder of where their sacrifices ended. And still, resistance was nearly impossible. To defy the Lord meant punishment. To defy the church meant excommunication. A sentence that stripped away one's place in the community, barred burial in consecrated ground, and cast the soul into eternal peril. The tithe was inescapable not only because the church had power on earth, but because it claimed dominion over eternity. For peasants, the pressure was unbearable. With both manor and church demanding tribute, how could they keep enough to live? The answer lay in yet another form of taxation, one not taken in coin or grain, but in sweat, blood, and time. If coin and crops were not enough, the medieval peasant still owed something far more precious: his labor. This obligation was known as the corvée, a tax not paid in money, but in sweat and blood. It was the invisible chain that bound peasants not only to the land, but directly to their lord's will. Several times a year, sometimes more, peasants were summoned from their cottages to work the Lord's domain, the land set aside for his own profit. They plowed his fields, sowed his seeds, weeded his gardens, and harvested his crops, all without a single coin of pay. In spring, they dug ditches and repaired fences. In summer, they cut hay for his livestock. In autumn, they hauled wagon loads of his grain into his barns. While their own fields waited, their own children went hungry. They labored for another man's table. The demands went beyond farming. Lords called peasants to repair roads and bridges, to clear forests, to dig ditches for drainage. When war loomed, the corvée could mean hauling stones for castle walls, manning siege engines, or carrying supplies for armies. At times, the line between tax and servitude blurred so completely that a peasant's life seemed divided equally between his master's work and his own meager struggle to survive. What made the corvée particularly cruel was its timing. A lord might summon laborers in the very heart of harvest, when their own families depended on swift gathering of grain before storms arrived. To disobey meant fines, beatings, or worse. So peasants bent their backs in fields that were not theirs, knowing their own crops might rot in the rain. Every call to the corvée was a gamble. Obey and starve later, or resist and suffer now. This labor tax was also a way for lords to display their dominance. Castles did not rise by noble hands. They were built stone by peasants, many of whom never lived long enough to see the towers finished. Roads and bridges, which nobles traveled in comfort, were laid by villagers with blistered palms. Even the mills and ovens that peasants were forced to rent were often constructed through their unpaid toil. The Lord profited thrice: from the labor, from the product, and from the rent. For women and children, the burden was no lighter. Women were summoned to spin, weave, or help in harvests. Children hauled water, gathered wood, or served as messengers. The entire household was consumed by obligations, their days carved apart by duties that profited everyone but themselves. And yet, the corvée was accepted as a fact of life. It was written into custom, enforced by courts, blessed by the church. For peasants, it was as immovable as the seasons. They might complain in whispers, curse their lot in secret, but when the Lord's reeve came knocking, they went. Because to refuse meant ruin, and ruin was swifter than starvation. The corvée revealed a brutal truth. Even time itself was not the peasant's own. From the cradle to the grave, every breath, every hour, every calloused hand was taxed. And still, this was not the end. For beyond the obvious dues, medieval society found ever stranger ways to extract wealth from its people. Levies so peculiar and invasive that peasants paid not just for living, but for every milestone of life itself. If the harvest dues, the tithe, and the corvée seemed crushing, the medieval world had more to demand still. Beyond the great, predictable burdens lay a web of smaller, stranger taxes that reached into every corner of life. For the peasant, there was no stage of existence too humble, no act too ordinary, that could escape a fee. Marriage, for instance, was not only a union of two souls, but a transaction overseen by the Lord. If a serf wished to marry someone from another manor, he had to pay for permission, as though love itself required a receipt. Without this fee, the marriage could be declared void, or worse, the couple fined until poverty bit harder than before. Inheritance brought no respite. When a peasant died, his family was forced to pay a relied, a death duty owed to the Lord. This often meant surrendering the best cow, the best cloak, or the finest tool in the household. In a cruel irony, grief was accompanied by confiscation, as though even in death, a peasant's family could not escape the reach of taxation. Even daily survival came with hidden tolls. To grind grain, peasants were compelled to use the Lord's mill and pay a fee. To bake bread, they had to use the Lord's oven. To press grapes into wine or olives into oil, the Lord's press was the only lawful choice. These monopolies ensured that every mouthful of bread, every sip of drink, carried a tax embedded in its making. Some peasants risked using hand mills or private ovens in secret, but discovery meant destruction of the tools and harsh punishment besides. Markets, too, were tightly controlled. If a peasant wished to sell surplus vegetables or livestock, he paid a toll to enter the market square. Even the road there might cost money, for lords and kings levied tolls on bridges and highways. A journey of a few miles could mean a string of payments, like invisible gates barring the way. And the church added its own peculiar fees. Beyond the tithe, there were payments for baptisms, marriages, funerals, even candles burned on feast days. Some parishes demanded offerings for saints' days or pilgrimages, ensuring that devotion itself became a taxable act. The line between faith and finance blurred until they were inseparable. The effect of these endless taxes was suffocating. A peasant might work from dawn until dusk, yet at every turn, marrying, mourning, baking, selling, he was reminded that nothing was free. His life belonged not only to his family, but to the networks of obligation and profit above him. Every joy, every sorrow, every necessity had a price. For peasants, these strange levies were not quirks of the system. They were the system. Together they ensured that escape was impossible. Even if a family somehow grew enough to eat and store a little for winter, the taxes came knocking, stripping away the surplus. The system left them with just enough to survive, but never enough to rise. Yet what made this machinery truly terrifying was not the taxes themselves, but the punishments for those who resisted. For in the Middle Ages, evading taxation was not only a crime, It was an assault on the very order of society, and the consequences were swift, brutal, and often final. To the medieval peasant, taxes were not optional obligations. They were as inevitable as the rising sun. And when someone dared to resist, the response was swift and merciless. In a world where order depended on obedience, to evade taxation was not simply theft, it was rebellion. And rebellion, however small, could not be tolerated. The first line of punishment was confiscation. If a family withheld grain or livestock, the Lord's bailiffs descended upon their cottage. They seized animals from the byre, carts from the yard, or even the very tools peasants needed to survive. A man who refused to pay his dues might find his plow dismantled or his oxen driven off to the manor, crippling his ability to farm the next season. Hunger, then, was the punishment as much as the seizure itself. Fines followed, often disproportionate to the crime. A peasant who ground grain in a secret hand mill to avoid the Lord's fee might be fined the value of several months' harvest. If he could not pay, he risked imprisonment. Village prisons were dark, filthy holes, where disease and starvation often killed as efficiently as the gallows. Few peasants could afford to linger long without working the fields. For many, imprisonment of even a few weeks meant ruin for their families. Public humiliation was another weapon. In some manors, defaulters were dragged to the village green, placed in stocks or pillories, and left for neighbors to mock or pelt with refuse. The shame was as cutting as the loss of property, branding the offender as untrustworthy in the eyes of the community. In a world where survival depended on neighbors' cooperation, social disgrace could be as deadly as hunger. For persistent offenders, harsher punishments awaited. Beatings with rods or whips were common, administered by the Lord's reeve before a gathered crowd. Some defaulters were expelled from the land altogether, a punishment that left them and their families wandering, landless, in search of shelter. In a society where every village was bound tightly by obligations, expulsion was nearly a death sentence. And in extreme cases, tax resistance became treason. To withhold dues owed to a king or to the church was to defy not just a man, but the divine order itself. Such defiance could mean execution, by hanging, beheading, or even burning if the charge was compounded with heresy. The fear of such punishment hung heavily over every household, a reminder that rebellion, even in the smallest form, could end on the scaffold. It was this culture of fear that ensured compliance. Most peasants never dreamed of resisting. They paid because the alternative was too dreadful. To cheat the taxman was to risk one's livelihood, one's freedom, even one's life. Better to surrender a portion of the harvest, however bitter, than to face the ruin of family and soul alike. Yet the relentless weight of taxation and punishment carried its own toll. Villages lived perpetually on the edge of poverty, their lives ruled not only by weather and war, but by the certainty that dues must always be paid. The people endured because endurance was the only choice. But slowly, quietly, the burden of taxation hollowed their lives, shortening their years, sharpening their desperation. And it was in that desperation that the true impact of taxes was revealed, not just in coins and crops surrendered, but in the way they shaped the very rhythm of survival. For taxes did not merely take wealth, they took time, strength, and hope itself. For the medieval peasant, taxation was not an abstract concept measured in ledgers or decrees. It was a daily presence, a constant shadow woven into every act of survival. To wake at dawn and walk into the fields was to labor not just for one's own family, but for the manor, the church, and the crown. Every loaf of bread, every animal born, every handful of grain was already divided before it left the peasant's hands. The effect on daily life was suffocating. A good harvest might bring brief relief, but it never brought prosperity. By the time the Lord's share was taken, the tithe delivered to the parish, the miller's fee paid, and the corvée fulfilled, little remained for the peasant household. A family might have just enough to eat, perhaps a little grain stored against winter, but rarely anything more. Hope of saving, of rising beyond subsistence, was crushed by the weight of obligation. In bad years, the burden grew unbearable. When rains rotted crops or pests devoured stores, the taxes did not relent. The Lord and the Church still demanded their share. This often forced families into heartbreaking choices to sell their livestock, their tools, or even the clothing off their backs to meet their dues. Some starved quietly to avoid punishment. Others fled into forests, becoming outlaws rather than pay what they could not. Hunger was the constant companion of the taxed. Malnutrition left peasants frail and vulnerable to disease, shortening lives already pressed by toil. Children were especially hard hit. Many never grew to adulthood, their strength sapped by years of meager rations. Even those who survived carried the marks of hardship in stunted growth and worn bodies. The average peasant rarely saw old age. Taxation had not killed them directly, but it had stripped away the margin of survival that might have preserved them in lean years. The psychological toll was just as real. Imagine laboring from dawn to dusk, yet never tasting the full fruits of your own effort. To watch barns fill, only to see wagons roll away with your harvest. To mend fields, build roads, and repair mills that profited someone else. Such labor bred a quiet despair, a sense that life was not one's own. It was endurance, not prosperity, that defined existence. Communities, too, bore the strain. Taxes divided neighbors, as some paid in full while others defaulted and faced punishment. Gossip and suspicion spread. Who had hidden grain, who had cheated the miller, who had fallen behind in dues. The bonds that might have united a village in solidarity were often frayed by the pressure of shared suffering. And yet, even in this gloom, peasants found ways to cling to life. Feast days offered moments of respite, when obligation paused and music, dancing, and ale lightened hearts. Villagers shared what little they had, sustaining one another through generosity when the system itself offered none. These brief escapes did not erase the burden of taxation, but they reminded peasants that they were more than the dues they paid. Still, the weight remained crushing. For most, life meant barely surviving under a mountain of obligations. The taxes guaranteed not only poverty, but permanence. Generation after generation lived and died beneath the same yoke, unable to rise above the soil they tilled. And in time, the despair this created ignited something more dangerous than quiet suffering: rebellion. Every chain, no matter how heavy, carries within it the possibility of being broken. For centuries, peasants bent beneath the weight of taxes, obeying out of fear, endurance, or faith. But there were moments when hunger grew too sharp, when injustice cut too deep, and when desperation burned into rage. Then, villages erupted into revolt, and taxation, the silent specter of everyday life, became the spark for rebellion. One of the most famous of these uprisings occurred in England in 1381. The Crown, desperate for funds after costly wars in France, imposed a new and deeply resented poll tax. Unlike other levies, this one was universal. Every man and woman, no matter how poor, was forced to pay. For peasants already stripped bare, it was the breaking point. Armed with pitchforks and cudgels, tens of thousands rose from the fields, marching on London under the banner of justice. They demanded an end to serfdom, fair rents, and relief from crushing dues. For a brief, electrifying moment, the peasants' voices shook the kingdom. They stormed manors, burned tax records, and forced concessions from terrified officials. But the rebellion, like so many others, ended in blood. Promises made by the young King Richard II were quickly broken, leaders executed, and the system restored with iron severity. Yet the memory lingered, a warning to rulers that even the humblest could erupt in fury when pushed too far. Nor was England unique. Across Europe, from France to the German states, peasant revolts flared like sparks in dry grass. Heavy taxation, whether for wars, for lords' extravagance, or for the church's endless demands, was often the cause. In France, the Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 saw peasants rise against their oppressors, driven by years of famine and taxation. In the German lands, waves of peasant wars in the 16th century carried the same cry: enough. The punishments for rebellion were brutal. Armies of nobles descended on villages, massacring men, women, and children alike. Fields were burned, cottages destroyed, leaders hanged in rows as grim warnings. The cost of resistance was devastation, and most revolts ended in ashes and silence. Still, they revealed a dangerous truth. The peasantry, though scattered and unarmed, was not entirely powerless. Even smaller acts of defiance carried meaning. Peasants sometimes hid grain in secret pits, feigned illness to avoid the corvée, or smuggled goods into markets to dodge tolls. These were not grand rebellions, but they were acts of quiet resistance, flickers of agency in a life dominated by demands. Lords and priests could never fully stamp out such defiance, for it sprang from the universal desire to breathe free. These uprisings, though often crushed, planted seeds of change. Over time, rulers realized that endless taxation without relief risked destabilizing their realms. Some concessions were granted, serfdom slowly declined, and new forms of labor and commerce emerged. The revolts may have failed in their own day, but they whispered of a different future, one where the peasant was more than a source of revenue. Yet while peasants risked everything to fight taxation, the lords and the church offered their own justifications for why the system endured. To them, taxes were not oppression, but necessity, the very lifeblood of order and civilization. To the peasants, taxes were a burden, a chain that robbed them of their labor and hope. But to those who wielded authority, the lords, kings, and clergy, taxation was not merely justified, it was essential. In their eyes, it was the framework upon which the world stood, the price of order in a chaotic age. The lords argued that their taxes were the natural right of land ownership. The soil belonged to them, granted by kings and sanctified by God, and those who worked it owed service in return. The rents, dues, and corvée were painted not as oppression, but as the lawful bond between master and tenant. Without these obligations, lords claimed, the manor could not function, nor the village survive. Protection from raiders, justice in disputes, and the security of walls all were cited as reasons why peasants must pay. Kings, too, had their rationalizations. To wage war, to defend borders, to keep roads open and markets safe. These, they said, required funds. Taxes were the lifeblood of kingdoms, the gold that paid soldiers, minted weapons, and built fortresses. Without them, the realm would fall to foreign invaders, leaving peasants defenseless. In truth, much of this wealth was squandered on dynastic feuds, courtly extravagance, and ambitious crusades, but the rhetoric was powerful. Who would dare argue against the safety of the realm? The church's justifications carried even greater weight. The tithe was presented as divine law, commanded by Scripture itself. To refuse it was to defy not a priest, but God. Priests preached that the tithe sustained not only the clergy but the poor and the sick, transforming peasant sacrifices into acts of holy charity. Cathedrals that rose skyward were described as monuments to God's glory, funded by the faithful offerings of the humble. To doubt this system was to risk the eternal soul, a far graver punishment than any imposed by mortal courts. Together, these powers wrapped taxation in a cloak of legitimacy. Lords spoke of duty, kings of security, priests of salvation. In this web of reasoning, taxes became more than economic burdens. They became moral imperatives. A peasant who paid grudgingly was not merely disobedient. He was ungrateful, disloyal, even sinful. Yet beneath these lofty claims lay a harsher reality. The wealth extracted through taxes seldom flowed back to those who provided it. While peasants starved, lords feasted in halls hung with tapestries, kings rode to war clad in gold, and bishops dined from silver chalices. The justifications for taxation cloaked inequality, turning necessity into exploitation. Still, these arguments endured because they worked. Most peasants, raised in a world where hierarchy was seen as natural and divinely ordained, accepted taxation as their fate. It was the order of things, as immovable as the seasons. Resistance was rare, rebellion rarer still. But even as rulers defended taxation, the weight of it slowly reshaped society. Over time, as economies grew, towns flourished, and monarchies strengthened, the old feudal levies gave way to new forms of taxation that foreshadowed the modern state. The legacy of medieval taxes was not only misery, but transformation. And so we reach the final question. What did this relentless system leave behind? What lessons linger in the shadow of medieval taxation? And what can it still teach us today? The peasants of the Middle Ages could not have known it, but the taxes that chained them to the soil were also laying the groundwork for the world to come. Their suffering, their endurance, and even their rebellions became part of a larger story. The slow transformation of Europe, from a feudal land of manors and parishes into the beginnings of modern states. The legacy of medieval taxation is first seen in its permanence. Unlike famine or war, which came and went, taxes were constant. Lords, kings, and the church built entire systems to ensure their dues were collected, recorded, and enforced. This infrastructure, bailiffs, sheriffs, parish priests, royal treasuries, was the skeleton of governance. In time, it evolved into national administrations, precursors to modern governments that still rely on taxes as their lifeblood. The harsh inequalities of medieval taxes also left lessons written in blood. When peasants rose against unbearable levies, rulers learned that there were limits to endurance. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie, and countless smaller uprisings revealed the explosive danger of exploitation. Though these rebellions were crushed, they planted seeds of caution. Over centuries, serfdom withered, commuted into rents, and slowly gave way to freer labor. The memory of unjust taxation remained a driving force in Europe's later revolutions. The Church, too, left its mark. Its tithe system ingrained the idea that obligations could be cloaked in morality, that taxation could be framed not as a burden, but as a higher duty. While today's taxes are not paid to save one's soul, governments still echo this rhetoric, arguing that taxes build roads, schools, and hospitals for the common good. The medieval peasant may not have recognized the argument, but he would have understood the logic all too well. At the same time, the strange and endless taxes of the Middle Ages remind us how deeply inequality shaped human lives. To pay for permission to marry, to surrender one's best cow in death, to be charged for baking bread. These reveal a society in which every stage of life was monetized. Modern people may bristle at their own taxes, but compared to the suffocating web of medieval dues, the system today is mercifully lighter. And yet, the echoes remain. When people complain of unfair taxation, of systems that favor the powerful at the expense of the poor, they speak in a tradition as old as the Middle Ages. The resentment of the taxed, the justifications of the rulers, the cycle of compliance and rebellion. These are not relics of the past, but living patterns that continue to shape politics and society. Perhaps the greatest legacy of medieval taxes is this: they remind us of the cost of endurance. Generations of peasants lived and died beneath a system that demanded much and gave little in return. Their resilience, though often silent, preserved communities through centuries of hardship, and their occasional defiance foreshadowed the rise of voices that would one day demand liberty, representation, and justice. If you lived in the Middle Ages, could you have escaped taxation? No. The hand of the Lord, the priest, and the king would have followed you from cradle to grave. But from their struggles, we inherit a world that slowly, painfully, began to question such chains. The peasants' burden was their tragedy, but their endurance was their gift, a reminder that even in oppression, humanity survives, and in time, it learns to resist.